The streets of Nazi-occupied Europe were suffocating under the weight of silence. Every whisper could be a trap, every neighbor a potential informant, and the black-coated Gestapo seemed to lurk in every shadow. Their iron grip stretched across cities and villages alike, choking resistance with fear, torture, and execution. To be caught in their gaze was a death sentence, and yet, within this atmosphere of dread, an unexpected resistance was quietly forming. 12 women, dismissed as harmless, overlooked as ordinary, daring to challenge the most feared secret police in the world. They were nurses, couriers, shop assistants, even mothers, women who blended seamlessly into daily life. But beneath that ordinary surface lay extraordinary courage. They carried messages hidden in loaves of bread, slipped false documents beneath piles of laundry, and delivered critical intelligence while smiling politely at German officers who never suspected a thing. The Gestapo's arrogance blinded them, and in that blindness, these women planted the seeds of deception. What unfolded was nothing short of astonishing. Lies woven into truth, danger masked by charm, survival hanging by a thread, and each move a gamble where capture meant unthinkable torture. Yet time and again, the Gestapo was fooled, played like puppets by the very people they underestimated. How did 12 women outwit one of the deadliest intelligence machines in history? How did they turn the shadows into weapons and lies into lifelines? Their secret not only shocked the Nazis, it stunned even their own allies. And this is their story, but behind every act of courage lies a price. And soon, these women would learn that the deeper they sank into the Gestapo's web, the harder it would be to escape. They were not soldiers. They carried no rifles, wore no uniforms, and had never marched across a battlefield. To the world, they appeared ordinary. Young women working as nurses in crowded hospitals, secretaries typing reports in dimly lit offices, mothers walking with children clutched to their skirts. And yet, these 12 would become some of the most dangerous adversaries the Gestapo ever faced. Recruitment did not come with fanfare. There were no grand speeches or solemn oaths. Instead, it happened in whispers, an acquaintance who quietly asked, "Can I trust you?" A note slipped under a door. A meeting in a cafe where a stranger leaned in and spoke words that could change a life. "We need someone like you. Take Marie," a young nurse in Lyon. To her patients she was gentle, kind, a face of comfort in the middle of occupation. But when the Gestapo executed her brother for distributing leaflets, grief hardened into resolve. Soon, she was carrying coded reports tucked inside medical supplies, her white uniform and steady smile her best disguise. Who would suspect a nurse carrying bandages of also carrying secrets that could turn battles? Then there was Sophie, only 20, a university student who once dreamed of becoming a teacher. She was recruited when Allied intelligence realized how easily she could slip unnoticed among German officers at the cafes they frequented. With her bright laugh and innocent gaze, she became invisible. But behind every casual word she overheard, every map she glimpsed over a soldier's shoulder, lay intelligence that would feed Allied strategy. She played the role of a flirt, a distraction, but every smile was calculated. Every encounter a risk, and Elise, a mother of 2, who by day queued for rations like every other woman in Paris. Her husband had been deported to a labor camp, and survival meant obedience. Yet at night, she carried false identification papers hidden beneath her child's blanket, passing them to desperate men and women fleeing the Nazis. The Gestapo never suspected her. Who would think a tired woman with a crying baby could dismantle their control, one forged document at a time? Each of these women had different reasons: patriotism, vengeance, grief, or sheer desperation. But what united them was the knowledge that capture meant horrors too terrible to imagine. The Gestapo had perfected torture, designed to break body and mind alike. A single mistake, a letter not burned, a glance held too long, a name whispered by someone under duress, and everything would unravel. Death was almost merciful compared to what these women risked each time they stepped into the streets with secrets stitched into their coats. Ironically, their greatest strength was the enemy's arrogance. The Gestapo dismissed women as weak, incapable of complex thought, mere accessories in the war. That blindness became their undoing. Marie was waved past checkpoints without a second look. Sophie was treated as a silly girl when she lingered near German officers. Elise, exhausted mother of two, was invisible in her grief. The Gestapo's contempt became a shield, a camouflage no disguise could match. But with each mission, the stakes grew higher. Networks expanded, resistance tightened, and Allied commanders began to realize just how effective these women could be. They weren't just couriers or messengers. They were the veins and arteries of the resistance, pumping vital intelligence across Europe. And the more they succeeded, the more dangerous the game became. For every coded note passed, every false smile forced at a Gestapo officer, every train sabotaged with information they had delivered, there loomed the same question: how long before the Gestapo noticed? Already, whispers were reaching the women that the Gestapo was tightening its grip, sniffing out leaks, growing suspicious. Torture chambers grew busier, and informants began to appear where trust once lived. The ordinary masks these women wore still protected them. For now. But shadows had a way of swallowing even the bravest hearts, and soon the Gestapo would begin to look more closely at the women they had dismissed for too long. Every mission was a gamble, every step a test of nerves. To survive in Nazi-occupied Europe as a spy was to walk willingly into the lion's den, smiling as if you belonged there, all the while knowing the lion's jaws could snap shut at any second. For these 12 women, infiltration was not a choice. It was the battlefield assigned to them. Their weapons were not rifles or grenades, but forged papers, coded messages, and the ability to make themselves invisible in plain sight. Take Claire, who secured a position as a secretary in a German administrative office in Paris. Day after day, she typed orders, filed reports, and poured coffee for officers who laughed about their latest raids. But while she appeared obedient, her eyes were always scanning, memorizing. In one report, she spotted mention of troop movements to the northern coast. She quickly copied the details, sliding the paper into her stocking when her superior wasn't looking. Hours later, her heart nearly stopped when that same officer asked her to fetch the very file she had tampered with. Claire's hands trembled as she handed it over, praying he wouldn't notice the faint crease where she had folded the page. He didn't. The intelligence she smuggled out that day reached Allied command, and weeks later it saved hundreds of lives. Others took on roles that seemed even riskier. Yvonne became a cafe waitress in Lyon, a place frequented by Gestapo officers who considered the small, dim establishment a safe haven. She smiled as she served their wine, listening as they boasted of raids and prisoners. She trained herself to appear disinterested, even flirtatious at times. Her tray balanced on one hand, while her mind raced to memorize every careless word. One night, an officer beckoned her closer, demanding she sit at his table. Heart-pounding, she obeyed. He reached for her wrist, only to pause, frowning at a faint smudge of blue ink staining her skin. Yvonne froze. The ink had come from a hidden note she had just delivered to another courier in the alley behind the cafe. If he asked questions, if he followed her after work, it would all be over. But he only laughed, dismissing her with a crude joke about clumsy waitresses. Yvonne forced a smile, then excused herself. Later, when she was alone, she collapsed against the wall, shaking. One smudge had nearly cost her life. Then there was Colette, who carried messages across the countryside disguised as loaves of bread. A baker's daughter, she knew that bread was one of the few things Germans rarely questioned. Her skill lay in hollowing out the loaves, hiding slips of coded intelligence inside. One afternoon, as she approached a checkpoint, a Gestapo officer stopped her cart. He tore open a loaf, sniffed at it, and sneered that it looked stale. Colette's blood ran cold as he ripped apart another loaf, crumbs scattering in the dirt. His fingers brushed dangerously close to the hollowed cavity where her secret rested. She forced herself to complain loudly, pretending to be an indignant villager, robbed of her family's food. Whether out of boredom or arrogance, the officer waved her through, tossing the ruined bread back at her. Hours later, when the message finally reached its destination, the Allied commander who read it called it a spark in the darkness. But each success came with a price, the tightening noose of suspicion. The Gestapo's eyes grew sharper, their interrogations more ruthless. Rumors spread of couriers disappearing, of underground networks shattered. Still, the women pressed on, each mission more dangerous than the last. They learned to mask their fear with laughter, to flirt when cornered, to feign stupidity when questioned. They became actresses in a deadly theater, improvising roles to survive another day. The danger lay not only in the Gestapo, but in the ordinary moments of life that could unravel everything. A child asking too loudly why Mama carried 2 loaves of bread instead of 1. A neighbor noticing that a secretary worked late but never seemed to bring home pay. A misplaced glance at the wrong officer. Every detail mattered, and every mistake could be fatal. One winter evening, Elise, still carrying documents hidden beneath her infant's blanket, was stopped in the street. A German soldier leaned down, cooing at her baby, before asking what was inside the bundle. Elise's throat tightened, but she smiled and shifted the blanket just enough to reveal her sleeping child's face. The soldier, satisfied, touched his cap and let her pass. The documents she carried that night would guide Allied bombers to a German supply depot, crippling a key transport line. But Elise herself wept silently as she walked on, shaken by how close she had come to betraying her mission and her child. These women lived with the constant knowledge that one breath out of place, one misstep in the Gestapo's lair, would mean chains, torture, and death. Yet they returned again and again to the lion's den, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Their courage was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, hidden, performed behind masks of ordinariness, but the Gestapo's arrogance could not last forever. Already, shadows were stirring. Whispers of betrayal, of networks collapsing, of informants embedded too deep to detect, and soon the lion would turn its head. The women had always known the risks. Whispers carried through every network, every coded message. The Gestapo is watching. But until now, it had been a shadow, a threat that lingered at the edges. In the winter of 1943, the shadow grew teeth. The Gestapo had learned. For months, the arrogance that blinded them to women's roles had been their weakness. But intercepted notes, vanishing couriers, and unexplained sabotage convinced them that somewhere, hidden in plain sight, women were bleeding their empire dry. From Paris to Lyon, suspicions spread like fire. Checkpoints multiplied. Random house searches became routine. The Gestapo no longer looked past secretaries or mothers with babies. They looked through them. Marie, the nurse, was the first to feel the walls closing in. One evening, she slipped into a hospital storeroom to pass a coded medical chart to a courier. The handover took seconds, but when she returned to her ward, she found 2 Gestapo officers waiting, their boots glistening with melted snow. They asked about a missing patient, one she knew had escaped through the Resistance's forged papers. Marie forced calm into her voice, pretending ignorance, but her throat tightened when she saw the officer's gaze linger on her pocket, where the faint corner of the forged chart still peeked. She smiled, feigned fatigue, and brushed her apron against her hip, tucking the corner back in. The officer's stare lingered. He said nothing, but the silence itself was a promise. "We are watching you." Elsewhere, Sophie, the university student, was nearly undone by a single mistake. She had grown bold after months of success, listening to German officers boast in cafes, scribbling their secrets into notebooks disguised as poetry journals. One night she lingered too long. A Gestapo officer noticed the way her hand clutched the book when he entered. He asked to see her poems. Sophie laughed nervously, pretending they were silly private verses. He reached for the journal, and in that instant, Sophie thought her life was finished. But just as his hand touched the cover, another officer entered, slapping him on the back, demanding a drink. Sophie slipped away, her legs weak, the journal pressed to her chest. Later, she tore out the pages with trembling fingers, burning them until only ash remained. The Gestapo's grip tightened further with betrayal. Not every villager was loyal to the resistance. Some were broken by fear, others seduced by money. One courier disappeared in the countryside. Days later, his name was whispered in interrogation cells alongside others. Networks cracked. Safe houses became traps. The women began to feel hunted, each errand more perilous than the last. Yvonne, the waitress, faced it head-on. One evening, after serving wine to a table of Gestapo men, she ducked into the alley to pass a note. The man waiting for her never arrived. Instead, a German officer stepped from the shadows, pistol in hand. "Looking for someone?" he asked. Her heart froze, but her face did not. She laughed lightly, feigning confusion, saying she had come outside for air. The officer studied her with cold eyes. Then with a smirk he let her pass. But Yvonne knew what it meant. The Gestapo was laying traps now, watching to see who stumbled. Elise, the mother, nearly paid the ultimate price. Carrying false documents beneath her infant's blanket, she was stopped at a checkpoint. This time, the soldier was not charmed by her smile. He ordered her to unwrap the bundle fully. Elise's hands shook as she pulled back the cloth, revealing her baby. But as the soldier leaned closer, his gaze sharpened. He reached into the blanket, straight toward the packet of forged papers. Elise thought her heart would stop. But at that moment, her baby began to cry, wailing so loudly the soldier recoiled in irritation. Cursing, he waved her through. Elise walked on, tears streaming silently, clutching her child tighter than ever. She had escaped, but only by a heartbeat. Rumors of torture began to circulate, carried in hushed voices through the networks. Captured spies were dragged to cellars where screams echoed for hours, sometimes days. Some never returned. Others came back broken, whispering names through cracked lips. For the women still in the field, the threat was no longer abstract. It had a sound, a face, a smell. Torture was no longer a story. It was their future, should they falter. The resistance began to shift, changing codes, rerouting couriers, creating layers of secrecy. But the Gestapo was relentless. They studied handwriting, traced typewriter imprints, even measured the weight of paper for hidden ink. They learned, and with each lesson the women's margin for error grew smaller. Yet still they carried on. Sophie returned to the cafes, her laugh brighter, her gaze more careless. Yvonne continued to serve wine, even as her hands shook when she poured. Marie pressed bandages to the wounds of both soldiers and spies, memorizing troop numbers scrawled on requisition slips. Elise walked the streets with her baby, the papers beneath his blanket heavier than any burden. They knew what awaited them if caught: chains, agony, death. And still they walked forward, because to stop was to surrender their homeland, their families, their very lives to the enemy. But the Gestapo was patient. It did not need all of them. It needed only one mistake, one slip, one woman to falter under the crushing weight of fear. And in the shadows of occupied France, that mistake was coming. They had been hunted, cornered, nearly broken. But even in the shadows of the Gestapo's tightening grip, the 12 women had been preparing for something far greater than messages hidden in loaves of bread or whispers overheard in cafes. Their networks were uniting. Their missions, once small and scattered, were now threads in a tapestry of resistance. And in the spring of 1944, as whispers of an Allied invasion grew louder, those threads wove together into a single, dangerous mission. It began with a railway line. The Germans depended on it to move troops and supplies toward the northern coast of France. Without it, their reinforcements would be delayed, perhaps fatally, if the Allies landed. Destroying it meant crippling German response. But destroying it also meant certain death if they were caught. Claire, the secretary, brought the intelligence. Working in a German office, she stole a map of supply routes. Her hands had trembled as she traced the lines of the rail network, committing every detail to memory. She passed it on to Yvonne, who slipped the document beneath the tray of wine bottles she carried through the cafe. By nightfall it had reached Marie, who disguised it as a patient's chart and delivered it to the saboteurs. The plan was bold: a coordinated sabotage across multiple sites. Rail lines would be destroyed, communications cut, and German convoys delayed, all in one night. Failure in any part could unravel the rest. The women knew it wasn't just about slowing trains. It was about giving the Allies the time they needed to launch what would later be known as D-Day. The night was damp and moonless, the kind of darkness that pressed close and made every sound sharper. Elise carried her baby into a farmhouse that doubled as their meeting point. Beneath the infant's blanket lay detonators, small and carefully wrapped. When she laid her child in a cradle, she passed the explosives to Colette, who tucked them into her bread baskets. It was absurd, almost comical, that the tools of war were passed hand to hand beneath the guise of motherhood and bakery errands. But it worked, because the Gestapo still underestimated them. Sophie and Yvonne worked together, cycling through the countryside with messages tucked into their clothing, signaling the various cells. Each woman carried her piece of the plan like a fragment of a beating heart, and when they finally gathered, the pulse was strong and unified. The target rail line lay in a wooded valley, guarded but not heavily. The Germans believed partisans might harass supply routes, but not that a group of girls and housewives would attempt an operation of such scale. That arrogance was the Allies' greatest ally. As the women crept through the underbrush, every step sounded like thunder in their ears. Claire whispered the map's details one last time, pointing toward the section where the track curved across a bridge. That was where it would hurt most. Marie set the charges with trembling fingers, her nurse's hands more accustomed to healing than destruction. Yvonne kept watch, her heart racing each time a German patrol's flashlight cut across the trees. Colette held the basket steady as Elise removed the detonators, her baby's faint whimper a reminder of what was at stake. Then, disaster. A German patrol approached sooner than expected. Their boots crunched on the gravel path, voices sharp and alert. One of them stopped, shining his light toward the bridge. The women froze, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. The soldier stepped closer. Another word, another step, and everything would be lost. It was Sophie who saved them. Stepping out from the shadows, she forced a nervous laugh, clutching her poetry journal as if startled. The soldiers barked at her, demanding what she was doing there. She stammered, playing the frightened student caught out after curfew. They jeered, mocking her trembling, and one reached for her book. Sophie let them leer, let them push her along, her face flushed with humiliation. But she had bought the others precious minutes. Behind her, Marie finished placing the final charge. Yvonne lit the fuse. They retreated into the darkness, every second stretching into eternity. Then the explosion ripped the night apart. Fire and thunder rolled across the valley as the bridge disintegrated into a rain of iron and splinters. German shouts echoed in the chaos, soldiers scrambling, searchlights slicing through smoke. But the tracks were gone, twisted metal tumbling into the river below. The artery had been cut. The women fled in all directions, blending into the countryside, into villages, into anonymity. By morning, they were back at their posts. Waitresses serving breakfast, mothers nursing children, secretaries typing memos. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The destruction of that railway line was only one piece. Across the region, other women, other cells, carried out sabotage that same night. Telegraph wires were cut. Bridges collapsed. Convoys were delayed by hours, sometimes days. By the time the Germans pieced together the scale of what had happened, it was too late. The sabotage had worked. The timetable of the Reich was broken. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, weeks later, they faced ferocious resistance. But the German reinforcements that should have crushed them never arrived in time. Trains sat useless on shattered tracks. Supplies languished in depots. Orders were delayed, rerouted, confused. And behind much of that chaos lay the courage of women, whose names the Gestapo had never even considered worth writing down. The irony was brutal. For years, the Gestapo had dismissed women as incapable of real resistance. They searched for men with weapons, men with guns and grenades. All the while, 12 women with baskets of bread, aprons, notebooks, and babies were unraveling their empire from within. The Allies would later call it one of the greatest intelligence victories of the war. But for the women, it was not victory they felt that night. It was exhaustion, fear, and the bitter knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. They had pulled the thread that would help unravel Nazi control. But they also knew the Gestapo would not forget, because when the smoke cleared, when the Germans sifted through the ruins of their broken railway lines, one question burned in their minds: who had done this? And the answer was already closer than they realized. The night of the sabotage had been their triumph, a thunderclap in the darkness. Bridges destroyed, railways twisted into useless metal, the Reich humiliated. For one brief moment, the women felt invincible. They laughed softly in secret meetings, sharing bread and wine, daring to believe they had beaten the Gestapo at its own ruthless game. But the Gestapo never forgave humiliation, and it never forgot. Within days of the explosions, a new terror swept through the villages and cities. Posters appeared on walls, offering rewards for information. Soldiers prowled the streets in pairs, stopping women with baskets, tearing apart their contents. Cafe doors slammed shut as Gestapo officers entered, their black coats heavy with menace. The net was tightening, and though the women still played their parts, they felt the eyes on them now, always watching, always waiting. The betrayal came from within. A man, once trusted as a courier, had been caught with forged papers. Beaten and broken, he whispered names between screams. Not all of them were true, but one was enough. It was Yvonne. She had served wine the night of the sabotage, smiling as officers laughed about silly French girls. Now, she was dragged from her cafe in broad daylight, her apron stained with coffee, her face pale but defiant. Patrons froze as the Gestapo cuffed her, shoving her through the door. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the clatter of a fallen tray. Everyone knew what that silence meant. Yvonne would not be coming back. The women heard the news in whispers. Some wept, others cursed, but all of them felt the icy hand of fear close tighter. If Yvonne could be taken, any of them could. And if she broke under torture, their entire network would collapse. Yvonne was thrown into a cell beneath Gestapo headquarters. The walls were damp, the air thick with the stench of sweat and blood. She had seen men dragged past her door, screaming, only to return silent, their eyes empty. The interrogator came for her with questions sharp as knives. Who were the others? Where did they meet? How did they sabotage the rails? She said nothing. At first she laughed, pretending ignorance, playing the part of the foolish waitress. But the Gestapo did not laugh. They broke her fingers one by one, demanding answers. Still, she held her silence. For days, the others carried on their missions, every step haunted by the thought of Yvonne in that cellar. Claire typed reports in her German office, her fingers steady on the keys, but trembling inside. Sophie passed through checkpoints with her poetry journal, smiling as if nothing had changed. Elise rocked her baby in the marketplace, hiding her terror beneath a mother's gentle lullaby. Each of them wondered, was Yvonne alive? Was she speaking their names? And yet the resistance could not stop. The Allies depended on their work. Every message delayed, every hesitation risked thousands of lives. So they pressed forward, even as their hearts broke. Yvonne's ordeal worsened. Her interrogator grew crueler, alternating between mockery and violence. They left her in darkness for days, then flooded her with light, asking the same questions until her mind blurred. Hunger gnawed at her, her body betrayed her, but still she whispered nothing. Her silence was her weapon, her last act of defiance. But silence came at a price. She knew she would not leave alive. And she was right. One morning, the cafe's regulars noticed the silence first. Yvonne's laughter would never again echo through those dimly lit rooms. Word spread quietly, carried from mouth to ear. She was gone. Some said she had been shot in a field outside the city. Others whispered she had been hanged in secret. The truth did not matter. What mattered was the message. It could be any of them next. The women grieved in private, their sorrow masked by smiles and roles they still had to play. But Yvonne's death was not in vain. The documents she had carried, the conversation she had overheard, the courage she showed under torture, all of it had already changed the course of the war. And her silence, her refusal to betray the others, saved lives. Yet fear lingered like smoke. With Yvonne gone, paranoia crept into every corner. Who would be next? Who had been noticed by the Gestapo's watchful eyes? Colette began to wake at night, hearing phantom knocks on the door. Marie jumped at the sound of boots in the hospital hallways. Sophie burned every page of her notes after writing them, convinced that at any moment soldiers would storm her dormitory. Still, they did not stop. If anything, Yvonne's death hardened their resolve. Elise, carrying her baby, whispered to the others that they must fight not only for the Allies, not only for victory, but for Yvonne, for the friend who had given everything. The Gestapo believed fear would silence them. Instead, it sharpened them into steel, but the Gestapo was not finished. Its interrogators knew that for every woman they captured, 10 more might rise. To crush the resistance, they needed something bigger, something final. And in the dark offices of their headquarters, they began to plan. The women could not see it yet. They still moved through the streets, blending with mothers and students and secretaries. But the Gestapo was already weaving its trap, baiting it with whispers, tightening the noose one step at a time, and soon the game would end. When the war finally ended, Europe breathed again, but the world that emerged from the ashes was forever changed. Cities lay in ruins, millions had been lost, and among the wreckage were stories buried so deep that even the Allies themselves had not known the full extent of the sacrifices made in the shadows. It was only in the months that followed, as records surfaced and testimonies were gathered, that the truth about the 12 women spies began to come to light. Reports described waitresses, students, mothers and nurses who had risked everything to deliver intelligence that shaped the war's turning points. Officers were stunned when they read how women had smuggled secrets past the Gestapo under their very noses, how railways had been destroyed by hands the Nazis never thought to suspect, how messages hidden in bread and blankets had carried the weight of nations. The Allies had always believed their own networks were strong, but they had underestimated the invisible army of women who had fought in silence. For many commanders, the realization was humbling. Their victories had been built not only on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over London, but in the small, hidden acts of defiance carried out by women who asked for no medals and often received none. Not all 12 survived. Some names were written only in the margins of reports, followed by the word executed. Others vanished into unmarked graves, their families left to mourn in silence. But their legacy endured. Monuments would later rise in France, engraved with their names. Museums told their stories. Generations grew up learning how ordinary women, dismissed as harmless by their enemies, had fooled one of the most feared intelligence agencies in history. Their courage had not been loud or celebrated in the moment. It had been quiet, determined, carried out with steady hands and beating hearts that never showed their fear. And yet, it shook the Nazi Empire to its core. The Gestapo, who once mocked them as inconsequential, had been undone by them. Every bridge destroyed, every train delayed, every whispered secret passed across a cafe table had chipped away at the Reich's control. And when the Allies stormed Normandy, it was the ghosts of those women's work that walked beside the soldiers, clearing their path, delaying the enemy, saving thousands of lives. Today, their story still echoes, not just as a tale of war, but as a reminder of the power of the underestimated, the strength of the unseen. 12 women who had no armies, no banners, no parades, yet who altered the course of history with nothing more than wit, bravery, and the refusal to surrender. Their legacy is not only triumph, but a question that lingers across time. How many other unsung heroes still remain in the shadows, their courage hidden, their names unknown? For these 12, at least, the world finally remembered. And in remembering, It was forever shocked by the secret that saved nations and the women who dared to defy the Gestapo.